Good evening, and I am here to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. William Billingsley. Dr. Billingsley prefers Bill, if I'm mistaken. The topic of his talk, Sue mentioned it before, is the race, religion, and reaction, the crisis of white supremacy and the challenge to American democracy in the early 21st century. And I think we're both fortunate and unfortunate to have this as our topic tonight. It's unfortunate because it's so timely. But just last week, the Department of Homeland Security issued a warning bulletin about the danger to elected officials of violence by white supremacists and right-wing extremists. We've kind of seen this. This is almost a straight line here, I think, between the riot/demonstration in Charlottesville, Virginia, straight down to the violent overthrow of the government, the attempt to violently overthrow our government in January. I think it's pretty much straight line. And I think we're seeing that now being played out in local affairs, the school boards and boards of education, city councils. So it moves on. It's maybe not a problem that's getting bigger, but it certainly seems to be a problem that's getting more dangerous. And we're fortunate. That's the unfortunate part. The fortunate part is that we have Dr. Billingsley here to talk about this. Dr. Billingsley has worked, I think, his whole career is he's been teaching, writing, and researching these white supremacist, white national groups, and the groups that came before them. You may be using different language, but really standing for the same thing. I don't think there's another person we could have found any place that's more, maybe even as knowledgeable about these groups and the people that populate them as Dr. Billingsley. Dr. Billingsley right now is a world history instructor at Saddleback College. He received his undergraduate degree at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and he received his master's degree and PhD right down the street from us at UCI Irvine. And he told me that the person that actually brought him to UCI Irvine is a person that some of you may know, John Wiener, who was on the Pacifica station here, KPFK. And that's what drove Dr. Billingsley from North Carolina to here, to us who is here. We see the actions of these groups when we watch the news. We watch this on the internet, read it in the newspapers. We know kind of what they do, but I think what most of us don't know is who the hell are these people? What are these organizations? What do they want? What are they really trying to accomplish? What's their end game? What motivates them? And when did they come to the conclusion that violence, terrorism, and intimidation were a way to get what they want? So I'm sure that after Dr. Billingsley speaks, we will all have broadened horizons about these organizations and the people who they are. Dr. Billingsley, as I said, is a world history instructor at Saddleback College. He is also the author of a book called, let me make sure I get this right, Communists on Campus, Race, Politics, and the Public University in 60s North Carolina. He was the inaugural winner of the Newman V. Bartley Award of the Southern Historical Association. That's an award, a grant for historical research. And Dr. Billingsley is now in the process of turning that research into a book about school desegregation in New Hanover County in North Carolina. He's also written articles, of course, and presented academic papers, just a cross-section so you know the kinds of things he deals with. End Poverty in California was his contribution to a book called The Encyclopedia of the Great Depression. Freeing the University, New Left Activism in the New South Community, Chapel Hill, North Carolina, 1961 to 1970. That was presented at the Interdisciplinary Conference towards a History of the 1960s at the University of Wisconsin. From Red to Black, 2 episodes in the anti-communist career of Jesse Helms, which was presented at the International Conference on the History of Anti-Communism in the United States at Harvard University, and The New Left in the New South. The title is actually longer, but I like the way that rolls off the tongue, so I'm leaving it right there. And that was given to the Organization of American Historians in Atlanta, Georgia. He's also currently working on research on the John Birch Society right here in Orange County from 1960 to 1964. So Dr. Blinsley really has traveled all over the country speaking about these types of groups and their attendant foot soldiers. Before he speaks, I want to thank Dr. Bartley on behalf of the Laguna Woods Democratic Club, Dr. Billingsley, on behalf of the Laguna Woods Democratic Club for speaking before the Laguna Woods Democratic Club tonight. And I know we're very anxious to hear what he has to say, so I will exit stage left and very pleased to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. William Bill.
Good evening, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you about a set of intersected issues that are of great interest and concern to me. And let me suggest at the outset they should also be of concern to you, to all of us who embrace and value democracy. The future well-being of American society and democracy are at stake. Make no mistake, we are facing a critical set of challenges at a very dangerous moment. A period of transformative changes and shifts in which major transfers of status and power are underway. Before I start, my topic is the crises of white supremacy. How many of you believe that white supremacy is in crisis? Is in crisis. That white supremacy has a long history. I don't think I should have any difficulty persuading you that white supremacy has a long and sordid history in the United States. But when I tell people today, white supremacy is unfortunate, and I'll give you some reasons why here momentarily, that today white supremacy is facing a series of crises. Now, when I say that to my students, they love to hear that. White supremacy is in crisis. Yeah. Now, we don't know how this crisis is going to be resolved, right? But as I just suggested to you, what's taking place are some major transfers and shifts in status and power, okay? One of those forms of status and power historically has been grounded in white supremacy, okay? We should also recognize when there are challenges to status and power, we should expect those who have a sense that their power and status are being challenged and drained will put up a furious attempt to reassert that power, okay? So with that, let me ask, as I begin, what are the changes, the transformations really, that are intersecting and conjoining in such profound ways to produce such major challenges to long-standing relations of power and authority? Some of the factors which I'm about to show you have been underway for decades now. Others are of more recent provenance, but each is applying great pressure upon the social fabric of American life. I'll make this part very brief, hopefully, in order to get on with the evening's principal themes, but I am open to discussing them during the Q&A period. So, and by the way, my wife, Colleen, she'll be advancing the slides, so I always want to recognize my wife, Colleen Tucker, here on my right. Major fault. My mother-in-law, Bridget Tucker, who is a resident of Laguna Woods, is in the audience tonight. I'd like to recognize her too. Bridget, if you will. Good. Okay, so next slide, please. First, the deindustrialization of the American economy. Beginning in the 1970s, American manufacturing entered a phase of contraction that continues. Industries such as autos, steel, the extraction industries such as coal and timber are shadows of what they were during the post-World War II expansion. One of my favorite writers, Barbara Ehrenreich, has observed that a man with a limited education, but with a strong back and a strong union, could make a very good living. This has been increasingly problematic, especially for many of the former beneficiaries, white working class men. You can see the signs of decay there, shuttered factory, and of course this is ravaging. If you speak in the mic, okay. If you advance, please. Here you can see what is known as the Rust Belt. This is the former industrial heartland of the upper Midwest. And again, it's where many of those, where the manufacturing center of the United States was located for many years. Of course, in recent decades, it's seen signs of decay. We can think of Detroit, Flint, and other industrial cities that have experienced decay, and there's some of the signs of it there. Persistent unemployment, underemployment, the decline of private sector unions, the loss of entry for upwardly mobile mobility for minority populations. Next. Okay. Also here, this is a very telling slide for me here. I found this a few years ago. 5 decades of decline. This is from the Wall Street Journal. White men in their 30s and 40s with a working class job or no occupation and no more than a high school diploma or GED. Okay. In 1970, about 95% of that demographic were in the labor force. By 2015, it had declined to 79%. The other factor here is even more shocking. The number of these men who are no longer married, from almost 90% in 1970 to just about 50% in 2015. Meaning they're basically adrift and without a basic social institution of support that will give them, another thing, psychological support. Okay? And again, I have 2 images of there, a man seeking work, but something else. One of the forms of status that was available to these men previously that is no longer exclusive to them is warrior status. And if you can't recognize that, that soldier there in paint is a woman. Okay. Next. Okay. Another factor. Growing wealth and income inequality. The accelerating transfer of wealth and income from the bottom to the top, what has been called the reverse Robin Hood effect, has created displacement, social pathology, alienation, resentment, and anger, especially among those enjoying a previous sense of prosperity, stability, and entitlement. This has adversely impacted both working class and middle class Americans. And you can see, again, the disparity in average household income between 1967 and 2012. You'll notice those at the bottom have basically flatlined. Those at the top have really, the top 5% have enjoyed a tremendous increase in income. Next. Okay, and here's one from economists at Berkeley. A tale of 2 countries. Okay, the share of U.S. pre-tax income accruing to the bottom 50%, the top 1%, since the 1970s, skyrocketing income increases and gains for the top 1%, and a steady decline for the bottom 50%. And of course, the numbers of people in those 2 categories are markedly different. Okay. And here again, a tale of 2 countries. As the industrial economy, the manufacturing economy declined, of course, what we noticed was the development of the post-industrial economy in society. And you'll recognize there, one area that has benefited from this economic transformation has been Orange County, California. Okay? Again, now it is computer technology, an information-based economy that we call high-tech, that are providing the most dynamic economic engines. The emphasis now is on education and specialized training. No longer will a strong back be a benefit. Okay? And of course, there's also a massive transfer of capital resources. I point out on the left, on the right over there, as you well know, California is the 5th largest economy, at least it was this morning. I think that depends if the French decided to work an extra hour or not, I'm not sure. But at the Silicon Valley, the thing that really strikes me, the Silicon Valley in the San Jose, Santa Clara corridor of Northern California is home to 1/3 of all venture capital investment in the United States. That is a shocking, I mean, just incredible, right? And of course, close to home, Orange County itself is the home to many Fortune 500 and web-based companies and biomedical companies. Next. Okay, another factor, generational replacement. This one is kind of tough for me to talk about. Okay. Here it is. The challenge to the cultural beliefs and practices of an older generation by younger generations. With the baby boomers, and that is my generation, with the baby boomers strenuously attempting to preserve their authority as cultural arbiters in the face of rising expectations and a cultural agenda from younger generations of Americans, which you see here, generations X, Y, and Z. Generation Z, a subset of which is called the iGen in reference to the iPod and the iPhone. This looks like my students here on the left. Usually they have their face buried in a phone. Okay. But here's the thing I wanted to mention here that has resonance for tonight's talk. The younger generations never experienced in America where formal racial segregation and statutory racial inequality was in place. They are much less inclined to tolerate expressions and symbols of white supremacy, say, for instance, Confederate statuary and memorials. They are much more likely to openly support anti-racist platforms such as those suggested by Black Lives Matter. Okay. The end of victory culture. This is what the cultural historian Tom Engelhardt has called the end of victory culture. This was a national narrative of triumphalism by white men as a sign of moral rightness. The good guys always win and vindicate or restore a sense of justice. This was a trope presented and reinforced in numerous ways, but particularly in movie and television programming such as the Western. Now, when does this begin to turn? The decline begins in Asia with the atomic horror of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, followed by a stalemate in Korea, defeat in Vietnam, and more recently an inglorious withdrawal from Afghanistan. Okay. This has produced a loss of confidence and frustration, and for men, the loss of an important source of status, the victorious warrior. Historian Kathleen Belew, whom will be mentioned later, observes that the early architects of today's white power movement were Vietnam veterans who came back in defeat without heroic status to a United States where racial minorities and women had begun an effort to claim the benefits and opportunities of the American promise. You need to go forward. Okay, yeah, demographic shift. This is a potent source of white panic, fear, and anger that is being stoked by some in our political class. An awareness of themselves as a minority, quote unquote. How is it possible to feel and express a belief in superiority when you are fewer and lesser in number? Perhaps take desperate measures, build walls, abuse and repress migratory populations, or direct violence against non-whites who are blamed for various woes and setbacks. All of these things have happened. But let me remind you, none of this will reverse the demographic shift that is underway. Okay. And incidentally, that's the latest from the Census Bureau. The estimate is 2043. In 2043 is the estimated date that the population of the United States will become what is called a majority minority. Whites, for the first time, will never by themselves comprise a majority of the population. And I point out this has important ramifications, and it already is having important ramifications for both social and political life. Okay? Psychologically, producing anxiety and anger at the specter of becoming a minority. Okay? And what else do I have up there? Okay. Next. and you can see it here. The face of America is changing. Next. Okay. The crisis of racial hegemony. And again, that's our focus this evening. And I hope as we look at this momentarily, I hope you'll recognize that this issue is impacted by the previous issues that have been mentioned. But here's the thing. What happens when evidence appears that creates cognitive dissonance concerning an assumption or belief in racial superiority? Now, let me explain. You may have heard the term cognitive dissonance. What it is, this is a concept coined by a very famous American social psychologist in the late 1950s named Leon Festinger. Okay? Cognitive dissonance is that kind of strangeness or feeling of insecurity that one experiences when two or more contradictory ideas enter the consciousness at the same time. Okay? For instance, and this is what we see on the screen. What to do, for instance, in the face of the reality of the presidency of Barack Obama. My sister-in-law in North Carolina, the next day, bought a gun. Right. Her sense of racial order had been disturbed. She was experiencing profound cognitive dissonance. Okay? But again, and we see it, if you go to the next screen, please. Okay, yeah. Again, we see it here on the screen. How do they respond? Let me say one more thing about Leon Festinger. One of the things he noted is how do people respond when they're faced with this dissonance? Do they give up their beliefs, their ideas? He said no. They double down on them. Okay? They double down on them. In this case, the contention that Obama was not born in the United States, thus he and his presidency were illegitimate. Now, what a relief. And of course, this is known as birtherism. Okay? Show us the birth certificate, they demanded. And here it is. When the birth certificate and the birth announcement in a Honolulu newspaper were produced, critics refused to relent. Okay? To accept this evidence meant there would be troubling psychological questions about white supremacy. Today, a substantial majority of Republican voters refuse to accept the white birth of Barack Obama. And still people still trying to convince them, yes, don't bother. Next slide. Here's what I came to the realization of sometimes. You may recognize him. He's a very famous Hawaiian entertainer named Don Ho. He's known for strumming a ukulele and singing a song called Tiny Bubbles. If a video were found of Obama's birth in that hospital, and Don Ho was in the corner strumming that ukulele, next. And then out the window there was a scene of Diamond Head and Waikiki, right? And in the other corner, next, of the room, there were hula girls. That would not convince them. They're not giving that up. The psychological consequences would be too disturbing. Okay? So, next. Changing cultural mores, personal and interpersonal behavior. And I think the problem here, of course, this is impacted in no small way by generational replacement. But I think the problem here, and this again, many of the most ardent animosities and disagreements and conflicts we have today are in the realm of cultural politics. But I think the problem here is the pace and rapidity with which these changes have taken place. It's absolutely starting. Issues such as cannabis legalization, same-sex marriage, the Confederate flag coming down. And the Confederate flag coming down, of course, a flag being lowered is a sign of defeat, a surrender. Okay? Transgendering and transgender issues. And it hasn't happened yet, but the proposal to put a former slave, Harriet Tubman, on the $20 bill to replace a former slaveholder. And to my way of thinking, more importantly, a slave trader. Andrew Jackson did not only own slaves, he bought and sold them, and of course displaced many thousands of Native Americans from their ancestral lands in the Southeast for the purpose of opening the area to plantation slavery. Okay? Traditional America. And you'll notice that word, you'll see that word again and again. It's because those anti-democratic forces out there that we're looking at and we're concerned about, what they want to do is they want to restore an America that's past. Okay? You know, as in, again, that word again, make America great again. Okay? And we saw this last week. I don't know if you saw, I'm going to mention him again in a moment. Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri, right? Espoused a restoration of traditional manhood, traditional masculinity, right? In fact, in terms of the changes that we've been talking about, or I've been mentioning, that's impossible, right? And I should point out that that post-industrial technological economy, a computer-based economy, really levels the playing field, I think, for women. Okay? Especially for women, because it doesn't require physical strength. But here's the thing that came to my mind that was not, it hasn't been asked or answered yet. Maybe someone should ask Senator Hawley. If there's going to be a restoration of something called traditional manhood, then there would have to be a corresponding traditional womanhood, right? And I'll say this. If white supremacy is going to have any vitality at all, it will require the subordination of women. Okay? Okay. So again, some other issues here. Again, traditional America witnesses the withering of its assumed cultural dominance. It assumed that its values were mainstream and dominant. No, apparently not. Okay? And we hear the plaintive cries, we want our country back. Translation, it's no longer dominated by people like us that we recognize as our co-equal peers. This country is out of control. We no longer control it. Next. Here, changes and challenges to gendered identity and status. And just to look at one issue, and the thing about it is, tonight, almost every one of these issues, things are happening so quickly. I feel like I have to update slides and information and lectures and everything almost daily, it seems, right? The number of women in office is amazing. But there it is very quickly there. I'll give you 2 dates. This is January 2015. There were 88 women in the House, 20 in the Senate. And look, and this is a recent development. Of the 278 women who've served in Congress, more than half have been elected since 1992. Okay? 23 of the 46 women who served in the Senate took office 1996 or later. But, and there you see the youngest woman elected to Congress from upstate New York, Elise Stefanik. She's not. Anybody know who it is? Yeah, right. And let me update this for you very quickly. Colleen, go again. Okay. And again. Okay. Again, elected in 2018, age 29. And one more. I keep updating. The 116th Congress that took office in January of 19, 102 women and 23 in the Senate. Now, what I have for you here, just quickly, I have 2 photographs, partial photographs, of a part of the Democratic caucus in the 116th Congress and a partial of the Republican Congress in the same caucus in the same Congress. So if you would, okay. And there you see, you probably recognize some faces there. We have a number of Maxine Waters, Judy Chu, Jackie Spire, and you can see Katie Porter in the upper. Okay. It's a composite of Americans. Okay. And now, and in fairness, there are a couple of women there, way in the back. Okay. 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 So let's begin. These developments, especially the transformations in economic life, are important because they necessarily will produce changes in the relations of status and power, including those of race and gender. Today, we're witnessing a furious reaction to those shifts and transformation by white supremacists and white nationalists who often shroud their beliefs and actions in religious mandate. We will mention Mike Flynn. Speaking of religious mandates, do that in a moment. And we should understand, while these groups are small, or they're small, only a small number of active partisans scattered among multiple sects and organizations, they are ideologically committed, they're trained, and they're equipped, ready and willing to engage in violence against their perceived quote-unquote enemies. So let's start this evening with a definition, or a few definitions, to be clear about who we are referencing. We're looking at the confluence of three distinct but related phenomena: white supremacy, white nationalism, and religion. So let's start. What is white supremacy? And I would like to start by making what I think is an important and necessary distinction between what might be called indirect or subtle forms of white supremacy and more direct and blatant expressions of it. Now, the second one, and that's the one we see here, is the one that we're most familiar with because it involves overt and visible organizations and expressions espousing racial dominance, belligerence, and directs appeals to contain and subordinate non-white groups. Here we have organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan, the Aryan Nations, which we'll be talking about a little bit later, among others. Now, despite a penchant for rhetoric that is hateful and sometimes violent, we might tend to minimize the issue of white supremacy as we observe that these are marginal groups with extreme views outside the mainstream of American life. If this is the essence of white supremacy, it would seem there is little to be concerned about. They are few in number, they are often castigated and ridiculed for their views. Within the mainstream of American life, a consensus has emerged that racism, however it might be defined, is morally wrong. Let me clarify and reiterate that. Okay? There is a consensus in the United States that is widely shared, even among those who sometimes directly and other times unwittingly engage in acts and expressions of racism, that racism is wrong. Those folks express great umbrage and take offense with being referred to as a racist. I contend this is an implicit acknowledgement that they too understand that the great majority of Americans do not accept blatant expressions of racism as legitimate. Okay? But here's the problem. We're going to look at a lot of extremism tonight. The problem is these extreme views and positions can be distilled and softened and rendered acceptable if the core assumptions are not exposed and challenged. Okay? Here's why. Next slide. There's much more to white supremacy than overt and visible expressions of racial animosity and hostility. First and foremost, and I have it up there in the dark at the top there, first and foremost, white supremacy exists as ideology and as a psychology. We cannot see ideology. We can see manifestations of it. Okay? It is internalized. It exists at what might be called the penumbra or the edge of consciousness. Day to day, it operates as an ideology that has been culturally transmitted and as a psychology that has been learned and internalized. Here, for the most part, white supremacy remains dormant. But it can be activated at moments of distress and dissonance. That is, when notions of racial order are questioned. Then it becomes something that we can see and can hear. So, what is the core of this ideology and psychology? It's there in the black letters in the middle. It is this. It is a belief or assumption about differences in human populations that we call races, which we know are socially constructed. Race does not exist outside of human experience. Modern science has long since determined that race has no basis in fundamental human biology. The core suggestion and belief of white supremacy is that persons of historically European descent, quote unquote, whites, are naturally and inherently superior to non-whites and accordingly should be in positions of economic, social, and political dominance. In other words, white supremacy is a fundamental denial of human equality. So what is white, at least before we move on, here's one of the reasons why I want to say that white supremacy is in crisis. In the late 20th century, early 21st century, it's been undergoing a series of challenges, first because of the hardships and adjustments of a faltering economy, an awareness of irrepressible shifts in American demography, but also an honored visibility of the cultural contributions and the political prominence of non-whites. Next. What is white nationalism? Okay. It's an adjunct of white supremacy. Frequently, it suggests a belief in a country or an area that is defined by an exclusive white identity and in which only whites are permitted to reside. This means the creation of an all-white homeland, or what is referred to as an ethno-state. Various white nationalists have proposed creating such an ethno-state in the Pacific Northwest. You see there the red shaded area. Believing that this was the only area that could be salvaged for white Europeans. That is to say, areas of Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming. This concept is often referred to by white nationalists as the Northwest Territorial Imperative, or alternately, the White American Bastion. For some white nationalists, this desired state would be won not through violence, but by migration and reproduction. But for others, such as Robert Matthews and the Order, a more militant means would have to be applied. To that end, in the 1980s, members of the Order conducted a series of bank robberies and armored car heists to finance such an operation. In July of 1984, $3.6 million was taken in an armored car robbery near Ukiah, California, to purchase land and to distribute money to various white nationalist groups that would spark a race war leading to territorial division. Now, something I don't have up here, I do want to speak to, and it's important, what is called replacement theory, or, quote, the Great Replacement. This is a conspiracy theory popular among white nationalists. It holds that elites are deliberately and systematically attempting to eliminate native white populations and replace them with non-Europeans. The idea first appeared in France about 10 years ago, decrying that Muslims would degrade and replace French culture through massive immigration sponsored by elites, namely wealthy and politically connected globalists. It featured a pronounced Islamophobia. Now, in the United States, replacement theory has been subsumed within what is called white genocide theory. Okay? Again, a conspiratorial notion. This is largely the same as replacement theory, but here Muslims are replaced by Jews as the responsible party. Posters and chants were seen and heard at the 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, reflecting this idea. Quote, "You will not replace us," and, quote, "Jews will not replace us." This is only rhetoric and symbolism, right? In a Twitter posting on white genocide, white nationalist and neo-Nazi Richard Spencer, more about him later, had his message retweeted, okay? Retweeted by @whitegenocide, twitter.com/real_Donald_Trump, okay? Spencer's response was, in his own words, and I quote him, "Wow, just wow." Right? Ladies and gentlemen, when you have the President of the United States using your language and affirming your thoughts, you've won a victory. Shortly after the election, Spencer labeled America, quote, "a white country," and led his audience in a chant complete with Nazi salutes, quote, "Hail Trump, hail our people, hail victory." Again, ideas have consequences. El Paso, Texas, I could have chosen any number of examples. I could have chosen the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. I could have chosen the Synagogue in Highway. But the one I chose, El Paso, Texas, August 3rd, 2019. Patrick Crucius, a 21-year-old from Allen, Texas, an affluent Dallas suburb, drove some 650 miles to El Paso in West Texas, where he entered a Walmart store and killed 23 people and wounded 20-some more. The FBI defined the attack as a hate crime of domestic terrorism. Crucius had earlier posted white nationalist and anti-immigrant statements on right-wing message boards. He also expressed a belief in the, quote, Great Replacement. Crucius told police investigators that he had driven to El Paso to kill Mexicans, to halt what he termed, quote, an Hispanic invasion. The El Paso Walmart shootings have been described as the deadliest attack on Latinos in modern American history. Next. Now, religion. Fun part. When I was asked to speak on the confluences of white supremacy, white nationalism, and religion, I was taken a bit aback. The emphasis on the first two was rather clear. However, religion, quote unquote religion, was much too generic and benign. So let's be more precise. It is various theologies, dogmas, and political agendas associated with certain claims to Christianity that we are concerned with here. And let me be even more direct. What will be forthcoming is not a broadside against Christianity itself as a system of historic belief and practice, but as you will see, certain applications that lend themselves to and provide ideological justification for white supremacy, white nationalism, and even violence against those deemed threats to a white Christian race and nation. Okay, let's resume, and let me give you some of the issues here in terms of the way various groups, white supremacist, white nationalist groups, attempt to employ Christian themes and messaging for their agenda. The first is an idea called dominionism or dominion theology. It's actually more of a worldview than a body of explicitly defined doctrine. It basically holds this, that only Christians are given a divine directive through a biblical mandate to occupy and govern all secular institutions until the return of the Christ. This was increasingly influential among Christian evangelicals in the 1980s as it called for more engagement and even a militant presence in the public political arena. It involved a number of right-wing theologues, none of which you've probably ever heard of, but dominionism developed a position of Christian nationalism that's present today. And I think you got a glimpse of that in the statement made by the disgraced and convicted former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, who called for one nation and one religion. Which one? He didn't say which one, but I think people understood. Okay. But here it is. Christian nationalism, that the United States originated as a Christian nation based upon biblical principles, and that its culture has been pushed in an ungodly direction by quote-unquote secular humanists. And in the 1980s and 1990s, basically we saw politically mobilized evangelicals using that rhetoric to condemn secular humanism. Reverend Jerry Falwell among others. But this would include examples such as abortion, prohibiting prayer and directing religious exercise in public schools, homosexuality, same-sex marriage, etc. Increasingly, dominionists call for the use of civil disobedience to restore what they viewed as a proper godly social order. As such, it influenced Operation Rescue and other anti-abortion militants who targeted clinics and doctors. A prominent dominionist operating out of Southern California, and for a while in the 1960s in Orange County, was Rousas J. Rushdoony. And he developed a worldview or a theology based upon principles that he called Christian Reconstructionism. Rushdoony proclaimed the impossibility of reconciling differences between Christians and non-Christians, and called for the application of divine law to virtually every aspect of public life. Here was a form of Christian Sharia. a vision of theocracy to establish God's kingdom on earth now. Now, while such ideas and panaceas failed to win a mass following, carefully selected elements did eventually become melded with elements of Christian right activism. This was manifested as a rejection of secular liberalism and democratic pluralism. It should come as no surprise, given this ideological platform, that today we are witnessing an increasing loss of faith, if not open hostility, among some professing Christians, particularly evangelicals, to democratic ideals, institutions, and practices. It goes something like this. What value is democracy if it doesn't empower us as representatives of divine will to implement and enforce a godly moral order? A key component of dominion theology and Christian Reconstructionism was that Christians should rule, exercising dominion by applying religious principles in all spheres of life. Some proponents advocated harsh repression, including the death penalty for blasphemy, adultery, homosexuality. Now such measures were unlikely to find broad acceptance, but there was support for what sociologist Sarah Diamond has called, and I quote her, soft forms of dominionism. These include promoting the idea that the founding fathers were evangelical Christians. Now, it comes to my mind, we might wonder if they had ever bothered consulting the religious ideas and beliefs of Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, among others. Okay. Now, then there's Christian identity. Christian identity is a white supremacist nationalism that grounds itself in a perverse theology of racism and anti-Semitism that took shape in the 1970s and early 80s. Christian identity possessed a core of racist paramilitarism, with followers defining themselves as, quote, Christian patriots or Christian nationalists. Now, I want to be clear here. Christian identity is not a formal denomination with a canon of doctrinal principles. Rather, it's a number of independent, about 15 to 20 or so churches led by figures who embrace racism, anti-Semitism, white nationalism, along with neo-Nazi beliefs. Now, before I continue with that, let me offer a brief aside. Today, a younger generation of white nationalists are much less inclined to cite Christianity as an inspiration. They often reference some or another form of Euro-paganism as a spiritual principle. Okay. Now, here's the message of Christian identity. It holds that the true descendants of the ancient Israelites are Celtic and Anglo-Saxon peoples. That is, white, Western, and Northern Europeans. Here is a racialized interpretation of Christianity. Europeans are the, quote, chosen people of God. In this view, only whites are capable of salvation and eternal life in heaven. Next. Okay. And I'll give you here, again, I'll give you a bit of it. This is the Reverend Thomas Robb of Harrison, Arkansas. And he's one of the churches. I'm referencing others. Pete Peters of LaPorte, Colorado, now deceased. And Richard Butler of Hayden Lake, Iowa. We'll spend more time with him in just a moment. I took this from Rob's website, ministry's website. We believe the Anglo-Saxon, Germanic, Scandinavian, and kindred people are the people of the Bible, God's separated and anointed Israel. Okay? And I point out, Rob also serves as the national director of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, a faction previously led by white nationalist David Duke. Now, next. Now this one's kind of scary, right? In recent decades, the person most associated with Christian identity was Richard Butler, who founded the Aryan Nations, a neo-Nazi organization, while serving as pastor of the Church of Jesus Christ Christian, located in the Idaho Panhandle. Butler grew up in Los Angeles and spent his early years in Whittier while working in the aerospace industry. In the 1930s, he had been active in the pro-Nazi Silver Shirts, an American adaptation of the brown shirts in Germany. In the 1960s and 70s, while working for Lockheed Martin in Palmdale, Butler immersed himself in the teaching of an earlier generation of white supremacists and neo-Nazis and moved to Idaho, where his Aryan Nations compound served as a hub to unite young white nationalist militants and neo-Nazis from around the United States and elsewhere. Butler and his followers declared that whites must dominate Dominion theology and called for the creation of an ethno-state in the Pacific Northwest, with non-whites expelled or exterminated. There was also a call for, quote, race mixers, homosexuals, and usurers to be put to death. This indirectly and informed and inspired the murderous crusade of Robert Matthews and his white nationalist terrorist organization, The Order, in the Pacific Northwest, as well as that of Timothy McVeigh at Oklahoma City in 1995. Both Matthews and McVeigh had imbibed the white terrorist messaging contained within the Turner Diaries. The Turner Diaries, go through it very quickly. What this is, it's sort of a racist fantasy novel. But for white nationalists, it serves as prophetic literature. Again, it is explicitly racist and anti-Semitic, and there's the general plot. The government is overthrown, followed by a brutal race war where racial minorities, gays, Jews are exterminated. From the language, race traitors, judges, professors, journalists, entertainers are publicly hanged. The organization seizes control of Southern California, and all of California is ethnically cleansed. Southern California is used as a base to launch nuclear strikes against New York City and Israel. And by the end of the century, by 2099, the organization has conquered the world and all non-white races have been eliminated. Pages from that, when Timothy McVeigh was stopped following the Oklahoma City bombing, pages of this book were found in an envelope in his possession. Okay. Next. Now, I'll go through this very quickly. This is from 2019, testifying before the Senate. FBI Director Christopher Wray, who you see here, he didn't want to acknowledge it. I think he thought maybe Barr and Trump might not like him if he openly acknowledged it, but he acknowledged that most of the cases being investigated by the FBI today are not foreign jihadists. Most of the cases he acknowledged, kind of grudgingly, that the FBI are investigating involving domestic terrorism are white supremacist, white nationalist threats. And again, what I would suggest to you, the threat to American democracy today is coming from within. The greatest threats are coming from within, as we've seen. Okay, next. Okay.
Between the years 2000 and 2016.
Yeah, we don't want to, there you go. Okay, very quickly. Episode, Charlottesville, Virginia. Again, this was the eye-opener. Unite the Right rally by white supremacists and neo-Nazis and other groups on the far right. They came armed with guns, knives, clubs, helmeted with shields, ready to commit violence. They marched to racist, anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim chants while displaying neo-Nazi banners, swastika, and Confederate flags. But the real troubling moment came in the aftermath. President Donald Trump attempted to create a moral equivalence between the anti-racist, anti-Nazi protesters and the white supremacists and neo-Nazis by declaring there were, quote, very fine people on both sides. Okay? Now, the white supremacists and white nationalist right interpreted Trump's message, not surprisingly, as a gesture confirming their legitimacy and a display of his implicit sympathy. Since then, on a number of occasions, the ex-president has either refused or been reluctant to unconditionally condemn and denounce white supremacy and its violent rhetoric and actions. We must ask why. Now, the episodes associated with white nationalist violence often involve acts carried out by a single person. However, this should not obscure the reality that the perpetrators are connected. They are part of a white power movement via the internet and right-wing social media platforms. They are not rogue actors or quote-unquote lone wolves as portrayed in some media representations. They are connected through social media, literature distribution, national and international meetings, and events such as festivals. Others of similar beliefs are aware of their intentions and encourage and support them in taking action in the name of white power. Now, move next, please. This is going to be a little disturbing. Okay. Where are these people at? Where are they nurtured? Here's one group, the Inequality division. Formed about 2015. It translates into German as nuclear weapons. This is an international terrorist network identified as neo-Nazi, white nationalist, anti-Semitic, homophobic. Members of Inequality have been arrested and charged with a number of murders and plot to engage in terrorist violence. Watchdog organizations estimate there are about 20 Inequality cells, each with about 3 to 5 members in the United States. As you see here, they're mostly young men. But this is far removed from Orange County, right? No. In January 2018, a young neo-Nazi and affiliate of Inequality, one Samuel Woodward of Newport Beach, murdered Blaise Bernstein, a young man, gay and Jewish, not far from here in Lake Forest. His body was found in a shallow grave, stabbed more than 20 times. Next. The Rise Above movement, a violent white supremacy group with estimated 25 to 50 members, based in Southern California, including a core in Orange County, Huntington Beach, Sacramento. Okay. This is a street fighting club using mixed martial arts to attack anti-racist protesters and those considered enemies. The group defines itself, and I quote, as the premier MMA club on the alt-right. In October 2019, 4 members, ages 24, 25, 29, 34, were arrested by local and federal authorities and charged with an attempt to commit violence in furtherance of a riot. Several members were present at the 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville and were videotaped engaging in violence there. The leader of the group, a resident of Sacramento, with several prior convictions and prison time for assault, keeps a large framed portrait of Adolf Hitler in his room. This group is more akin to the more well-known Proud Boys. They are street brawlers, xenophobic, misogynistic, claiming to be defenders of, quote, Western civilization. Next. Now, I hate to put it this way, but I'll call them this, I'll quote, the intellectuals. I've characterized many of these young white men who are drawn into militant white supremacist, white national circles, often as poorly educated and socially marginal. We should not be deluded, however, into thinking, as a number of my students do, that white supremacists are, to use some of the characterizations of my students, quote, ignorant, stupid, uneducated, etc. The racist right can call upon a number of writers and thinkers to provide intellectual support for their beliefs and cause. Here is a small selection of them. Richard Spencer, I've mentioned him before. You'll notice near impeccable academic credentials. University of Virginia, an honors student at the University of Chicago with an MA in Humanities and a PhD student at Duke University until he dropped out. I would like to know why he dropped out. Right? I have some ideas about that. But I'd like to ask him. But anyway, Richard Spencer, a white nationalist and a neo-Nazi. Spencer promotes the idea of white genocide and dispossession. To quote him, our dream is a new society, an ethno-state that would be a gathering point for all Europeans. It would be a new society based on very different ideals than, say, the Declaration of Independence. Okay? He has also called for peaceful ethnic cleansing by assigning separate territorial status to different ethnic and racial groups. Keep going. Jerry Taylor, again, notice B.A. Yale, MA from the Harris Institute of Political Studies. Go ahead and click a little bit more for us. Okay, stop there. Okay. But Jerry Taylor, born in 1940, is a resident of Virginia, and what Taylor attempts to do is give racism a highbrow scholarly style. He's a writer and publisher of tracts proposing eugenics and scientific racism, as well as various programs of racial segregation including the prohibition of non-white immigrants from entering the United States. One more time. There. And in 2016, he paid for and wrote and produced a number of robocalls throughout in a number of primaries in support of Donald Trump. Okay. Next. Okay. William Johnson. I'm going to bring this close to home very quickly. William Johnson is a leader of what is called the American Freedom Party, whose declared purpose is to represent, and I quote him, to represent the unique political interests of white Americans. Johnson has called for the deportation of all non-whites from the United States and has authored a proposed constitutional amendment that reads in part, quote, "No person shall be a citizen of the United States unless he is a non-Hispanic white of the European race. Only citizens have the right privilege to reside permanently in the United States." Now, Johnson's ideas and who he was were well known. Next slide, please. One more. In 2016, the Trump campaign selected him as a California delegate to the Republican National Convention until it was exposed who he was, and then, of course, he withdrew. They understood who he was quite well. One more thing, one more clip. He's resident of Orange County. Next. Okay. Kevin Mcdonald. Kevin Mcdonald is a retired professor of psychology at Cal State Long Beach. He's affiliated with white supremacists and the racialist right on the basis of an unrelenting anti-Semitism. The Anti-Defamation League has called McDonald, quote, "the primary voice for anti-Semitism for far-right intellectuals." His online magazine announces as its purpose, and I quote, "to present original content touching on the themes of white identity, white interest, and the culture of the West." Click. A resident of Laguna Hills. Yeah. One more. We're almost home here. What about the Proud Boys? Do they possess an active component of white supremacist ideology? Publicly and officially, they deny it and avoid specific rhetoric or symbolism that would link them directly to white supremacy or white nationalism. But the profile is very similar to the more explicitly white supremacist groups, and as we can see from the quotes on the screen, some of their leaders and spokesmen are explicitly racist and anti-Semitic. The Proud Boys view Donald Trump as a leader to be listened to and obeyed. They were present at the January 6th insurrection at what they perceived as the behest of their leader. Perhaps the most shocking revelation of this linkage came when the president was asked to disavow the Proud Boys. He responded by directing them to stand down and stand by, as a general giving a command to his troops. The Proud Boys smiled and understood. They remained ready to be called into action again. Next. The Oath Keepers claim to be merely patriotic defenders of the Constitution, but they too are angry white men and of most concern. This is the most problematic thing about this group. Many of them are current and former police officers and military personnel. They are anything but politically neutral, and they participated in an organized, coordinated manner on January 6th. The danger here comes when law enforcement officers refuse to enforce laws that they don't like based upon a claim of constitutionality, and perhaps intimidate, arrest, and use violence against those they view as a threat to their worldview. It is increasingly clear that many Oath Keepers are willing to use violence and extra legal means to restore a sense of empowerment. And the sense of power that they wish to protect is a racialized white power of white men. For white supremacy to be restored, it will require the subordination of women. Now, and there we were on the steps of the Capitol. At this moment, I want to stop for interpretive emphasis. Here's the critical takeaway and concern about what we've been discussing. There are increasing signs that white supremacy, white nationalism, Christian nationalism are influencing the mainstream of the political culture. They've moved from the margins, from the fringes to the mainstream. This is evident in what is steadily appearing as ideology and rhetoric within the Republican Party. And by no means did this begin, nor does it end with Donald Trump. Several years ago, white supremacy and replacement theory was openly endorsed by one Republican officeholder, former Congressman Steve King of Iowa. King was reprimanded by the Republican leadership and stripped of his committee assignments. More recently, current Congressman Paul Gosar, a gift that gives ungiving, I guess, has openly embraced such ideas and rhetoric and has spoken at events sponsored by and attended by white nationalist figures. And he has done so without reprimand. Okay. Senators Josh Hawley of Missouri and Ted Cruz of Texas have used rhetoric reflective of Christian nationalist sentiment. And then, of course, there was within just a few days ago, the statement by Mike Flynn. Now, the question is, how extensive and embedded is Christian nationalism and white nationalism becoming within the Republican Party? It's difficult to precisely assess, but we should acknowledge that traditional conservatism has been sent reeling. Okay? And in some ways, it's being driven from the field. It has been supplanted by right-wing populism that shares numerous characteristics with fascism, not the least of which is ethno-nationalism and racist ideology. The populism increasingly at the forefront of Republican politics, especially in local and state politics, is transforming it into a people's party, or more specifically, a white people's party. Increasingly willing to defend or acquiesce to a thinly veiled white supremacy. In no small part, this is the result. There's the crisis. In no small part, this is the result of a growing awareness that they are a party appealing to an increasingly and steadily becoming a minority of Americans. The so-called Southern strategy formulated in the 1960s to appeal to working class and suburban white voters paid electoral dividends for decades. Now it has become a trap from which there is no easy escape amid the specter of electoral decline and perpetual defeat. They are becoming angry, frightened, unwilling to redefine themselves in order to appeal to a broader cross-section of Americans, but willing to use undemocratic means, including increasingly blatant forms of voter suppression, extreme partisan gerrymandering, and yes, even violence to remain in power. Let me conclude with this. What is to be done? I would like to leave you with 5 recommendations in dealing with the questions and problems presented here in the various iterations of white supremacy and the suppression that comes with it. And without apology, I want to be emphatic here. First, appeal to facts, speak truth. Demand and defend the democratic right to vote. Secondly, refuse to be silent. Affirm the freedoms of the First Amendment. Third, give the problem a name, white supremacy. Say the words, white supremacy, and denounce it as a violation of American ideals. With its sordid anti-democratic history, it is un-American, it is not who we are or aspire to be. Do not give white supremacy a pass. It is a grave threat to our democracy. Fourth, make politics a regular part of one's life and make your politics public. We should be highly motivated to espouse and preserve democracy at every turn and opportunity. Become more informed. Read and listen. And if you need something to read on the topics and themes of the night, here next are 2 suggestions. First, Timothy Snyder, a historian at Yale, has literally written the book on the approach of authoritarian governments and the undermining of democratic governments on tyranny, 20 lessons from the 20th century. The thing, as I read, it's a small book. It's easy to read, but it's really to read. He says, you know, when the police start going over, you're in trouble. Okay. Kathleen Ballou, a historian at the University of Chicago, Bring the War Home, The White Power Movement, Paramilitary America is a recent book, and also a very good book on white power movements, on white supremacy, white nationalist organizations. Although this was published just a few years ago, it's already somewhat dated. The developments are happening so quickly. So again, thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity this evening. And I have time for some questions if you'd like to ask any questions. But thank you. It's been a great meeting with you.
If anybody has any questions, just raise your hand. I'll bring the microphone over.
I would like to address what you're saying is coming to pass, and in the Virginia election we have what is now critical race theory and whatnot. How are we going to win that argument, since it seems to have taken the suburban women to believe that their children are being indoctrinated and, you know, whatever, logically decent people who are taking this as a threat?
Yeah.
How do we take care of it?
Yeah. Well, one thing is, it's so easy to evoke white fear and white panic, especially if something is not understood, it's not known, it's kind of ambiguous or amorphous as critical race theory is. But my sense is that one of the strategies has to be employed against that kind of politics is you have to address it or face it head on. You can't try to skirt it or slip away from it, right? In fact, the fact is, what critical race theory is, to most people who don't even know what it means, is that it is simply a stalking horse to silence any discussion of the kind of things we've been talking about tonight, and what the 1619 Project is about. To have a discussion about the history of race, of racism, of slavery in the United States. I think that's basically it's going to be a major issue for the Republican Party next year in the midterm elections. I don't have any doubt about that.
So how do we fight it?
I don't know. I'm not a political strategist. I would basically say this: that critical race theory is intellectually valid. Okay, it is intellectually valid. We have a long history, well-documented history of structural racism in the United States, beginning with the institution of slavery, right? And those structures have not disappeared. They are embedded within our institutions, especially legal institutions. Okay, so I would never suggest that we should try to avoid those discussions. I would basically, I think one of the things we might want to do is have some of the people associated with critical race theory basically become more public and explain what their work is about, because their work is legitimate. Probably the most prominent figure associated with critical race theory is a professor of law at UCLA. Okay, her name is Kimberly Crenshaw. Okay, she's better known for a concept called intersectionality. That basically you can't study race, gender, and class separately because they intersect in so many ways. But what I would basically point out what this is. It's a stalking horse for white supremacy. And white supremacy is a form of racism. Nobody wants to be a racist. Okay, that's what I would do. Yes.
If I could just say that critical race theory is not taught in K through 12, okay? And that's really the bottom line. So we need to just tell people that what is being taught is the history of the United States, including slavery, including racism, including the history of all the ethnic groups in America, not just the history of the whites in America.
Any other questions?
Thank you very much for that wonderful talk. It's being said that democratic leaders, politicians, voters, people are responding to the challenges of white supremacy and its and the ideology that's in the Republican Party by essentially bringing a rule book and a position paper to a gunfight. What's your reaction to that?
I'm not exactly sure what you're getting at there, but I think what I understand you mean is that, and it's sort of a continuation of the question from the rear, from the back of the room, is that Democratic politicians are often just too timid about addressing these issues. They need to be more proactive and assertive. I don't think you can run from it or try to hide from it or try to let's move on to something else. I don't think that's the critical issue, critical race theory, but it's going to be an issue in the midterm election, no question about it. It'll have to be addressed, and I think if I were a prospective office holder or strategist for a candidate, I certainly would have a well-defined answer in place, right? And I would test that answer to see how it goes with focus groups, especially those suburban white women that were targeted in Virginia. Yes.
My experience, when you're dealing with people like that, the first thing you do is you challenge them. Why do you feel that way? What is the source of your, you really push them to the wall. You're going to hear some things that are totally outrageous. I've talked to some Trump supporters. Why do you support them? Well, because there's all kinds of Muslims in government. There weren't anywhere at the time that this was. So you challenge these people. Whether or not that, but the one thing you don't let them do, get away with these ridiculous statements. People are, I'm not the type that's bashful. I will confront, I don't care who the hell it is, I will confront them directly, and we may not agree, we may disagree, that's one of those things you go through in life. But too many people are too damn timid. The Democratic Party itself is too damn timid. They're afraid they're not going to be liked, or God knows what they're afraid of. I'm 96 years old. The last thing, World War II, but the last thing I'm concerned about is whether or not I'm going to be liked.
My name is Ramesh Joshi, and I live in this community. And I have been a victim of racial discrimination. I tried my best to oppose, as you said, right? I submitted all the proof I could. Nothing happened. They say, oh, we investigated, and nothing happened. What I suggested was that in the Laguna Woods itself, there must be an ombudsman or a diversity officer, as some of the companies have it. They have a diversity officer, so you go and talk to him, report to him, and he can take care of it, finds out. Now, what happens in an institution or any company, if you don't do that, you report it to the boss goes further, and they say, oh, there is nothing else. If you want to work here, this is how it's going to be. That's what I have felt. And I'm living with it.
That's okay.
Is it a short question, Laura?
Not really, that's okay.
Okay, it's 9 o'clock.
Yeah, that's fine.
I think that we
Sorry to everybody that we missed.
Can we have another round of applause, please, for Dr. Davis? I think we all learned so much tonight, probably more than we want to know, really. We do need to write down your 5 things that we need to do I will need to get them from you. I'm not sure I got them all. Appeal to facts, refuse to be silent, give the problem a name, white supremacy, and make politics a part of your life. Well, that's why you're here, okay? We all want you to make politics a part of your life. And it's up to us to urge the Democrats to be more vocal on all these issues. I want to thank everybody for being here tonight. I want to announce that we collected $1,007 tonight for South County Outreach. That's just amazing. Thank you so much for your generosity. That means over $1,500 total. That's a record. Please, if you have any empty water bottles, we'd like to keep them. We give them to Kathy Aubert. She left already, but we'll get them to her. She collects them for South County Outreach. Every month, she collects enough recyclable bottles to give a $200 check to South County Outreach every month. Okay, so that is amazing. Give her a hand even though she's not here. We want to thank you all for being here and for your generosity. We want to thank Dr. Billingsley and his wife Colleen and his mother-in-law Bridget Tucker. We hope to see you on the 19th. That's this Friday from 4 to 5 on El Toro for our Stop Hate rally. And then we hope to see you December 6th for the holiday party. Meanwhile, thank you for staying so late tonight and happy Thanksgiving to all of you.